The coolant reading was wrong by 0.4%, and nobody wanted to hear about it. Nora Wren sat on an overturned crate in the reclamation bay of Halyard Depot, a hand terminal balanced on her knee, running the same number through the same equation for the third time. 0.4%. Small enough to ignore. Small enough that everyone above her pay grade already had. Around her, the bay hummed with the particular chaos of a room nobody respected. Racks of stripped conduit lined one wall, sorted by a system only she and two other people understood. Bins of salvaged fasteners sat beneath a hand-painted sign that read, in 3 languages, probably still good. The air smelled like hot metal and recycled oxygen that had been through too many lungs already. A Kesser clerk named Priff stood in the doorway holding a manifest like it might bite him, wings folded tight against his narrow shoulders, feathers the color of wet slate. The overseer wants the salvage quota met by second bell, Priff said. Not almost met. Met. I heard you the first time, Nora said, without looking up. You said that the first time, too, and it was not true then. Nora set the terminal down. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with the build of someone who had spent a childhood carrying water buckets instead of going to a gym, and hands permanently stained grey from grease that never quite scrubbed out. She had been on Halyard Depot for 6 years. In that time she had learned exactly one thing that mattered. Nobody here believed reclamation was a real department. It was where broken things went, and where, by extension, they assumed broken people went too. Tell the overseer the quota's low this cycle because half of what came off the last supply run is coolant line waste, she said. Which is interesting, actually, because the coolant lines shouldn't be shedding that much material yet. Not for another 11 months, by spec. Priff blinked all 3 of his eyelids in sequence, which was Kesser for I have no idea what you just said and no interest in finding out. Write it in the report. I did write it in the report. Nobody reads the report. That is not my department's failure. Never said it was. Priff left. Nora watched the door hiss shut behind him and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of feeling tired before she picked the terminal back up. The truth was, she liked the reclamation bay more than she would ever admit to a Kesser with a clipboard. It was the only room on Halyard Depot that made sense to her. Out there, past the bulkhead, was a station built by species who had never once, in their long comfortable histories, run out of anything important. In here was a room built entirely from the things they'd thrown away, and every one of those things still worked if you were patient enough to ask it why it had stopped. Across the bay, an Australian engineer named Fen Okra was elbow-deep in the guts of a water reclaimer, 6 segmented arms moving in a rhythm that always made Nora think of a spider playing piano. Fen didn't look up either, but they'd clearly been listening. You are going to end up filing that coolant number with the fleet office instead of station maintenance, Fen said, voice clicking faintly on the consonants the way all Australi speech did when translated through a throat that hadn't evolved for human phonemes. You know this. I know this. Priff knows this and is too afraid of being wrong in front of you to admit it. I'm not filing anything with the fleet office. I don't have clearance to file anything with the fleet office. You have clearance to be right, which is worse, on a station like this one. Nora almost smiled. Almost. Halyard Depot sat at the ragged edge of Thren compact space, a way station strung between 3 systems that had been quietly under blockade for the better part of a year. Not a shooting blockade, nothing so clean. A slow one. Supply convoys rerouted for efficiency. Ration allotments trimmed by percentages too small to protest and too consistent to be accidental. The kind of siege that didn't announce itself, so that by the time anyone noticed, they'd already adjusted to being hungry. Reclamation existed because of that slow squeeze. Every bolt, every meter of wire, every liter of water that came through this bay was one the station didn't have to beg the supply lines for. It should have made the department essential. Instead it made it embarrassing, a visible reminder, every single day, that Halyard Depot was not as well provided for as its administrators liked to pretend in their reports to the compact. Nora flagged the coolant number a 4th time, attached it to a maintenance ticket instead of a supply report, downgraded the urgency so it wouldn't get auto-rejected for looking alarmist, and sent it into the queue behind 400 other tickets that would probably never be opened. She'd learned that trick years ago. A report marked critical from a reclamation clerk got read by no one, while a report marked routine occasionally got read by someone bored enough to open it. It wasn't a good system. It was the only one she had, and on Halyard Depot you used the tools available to you instead of waiting for better ones that weren't coming. Her terminal chimed with the day's ration notice a moment later, a small, unremarkable sound that had, over the last year, come to mean something slightly different each time she heard it. The notice told her, in the same flat administrative language it always used, that standard caloric allotments for non-priority personnel would remain at 91% of baseline for the coming cycle. 91% had been the number for 4 months now. Before that it had been 93, and before that, 96. Nobody announced the drops. They simply happened, 1 percentage point at a time, small enough that complaining about any single cycle made a person sound petty, and consistent enough that if you added them all together, you got something that looked, from a distance, uncomfortably like a plan. Nora had grown up somewhere that taught her to notice patterns like that. It was not a comfortable skill. It was, however, a useful one, and she went back to sorting bolts, because the quota, unfortunately, was real, even if the number that actually mattered wasn't going anywhere. She noticed the second thing 2 hours later, and this one she couldn't file away as easily. A supply crate had come down from the last convoy marked reclamation, non-essential, the kind of label that meant somebody upstairs had decided its contents weren't worth tracking closely. Inside was the usual mess: crack housing units, a spooled length of superconductor cable with a bad section in the middle, 3 fuel couplings too worn for the ships that had shed them. And, at the bottom, a data spike. Cracked casing, clearly meant for the scrap heap. Nora almost tossed it in the recycler without a second look. Something made her plug it into a reader first, a habit, mostly, the same instinct that made her check every coat pocket before she donated a coat. The spike held a partial inventory ledger. Corrupted, fragments only, but enough to make her stomach do something small and unpleasant. According to the fragment, Halyard Depot's listed coolant reserves, the number quoted in every official report she'd ever seen, did not match the number the spike remembered logging 6 months ago. The difference wasn't rounding error. It was measured in tons. She sat very still for a moment, looking at 2 numbers that shouldn't have disagreed with each other, on a station where every number that mattered had already been trimmed to the edge of comfortable. Then she copied the fragment onto her own terminal, tucked the spike into her jacket instead of the recycler, and told herself it was probably nothing. She did not, this time, tell herself it very convincingly. The overseer's office sat at the station spine, all soft light and Kessa architecture, narrow, vertical spaces built for creatures who like to perch as much as stand. Bell and Thrace stood behind her desk when Nora was let in, feathers along her crest slightly raised, which in Kessa body language meant irritated, but performing patience for an audience. Efficiency review, Thrace said, without preamble, sliding a data slate across the desk. Fleet Command wants every department on Halyard justifying its resource draw by the end of the cycle. Reclamation draws power, water, and floor space for a return that, on paper, looks marginal. Nora picked up the slate. The numbers on it were technically accurate and completely misleading. The way numbers usually were when somebody wanted a particular conclusion. Reclamation's output was measured in raw material recovered, easy to undercount, easy to make look small next to the department's overhead. On paper, Nora said carefully, this looks like we cost more than we save. In practice, every meter of cable we recover is a meter the supply convoys don't have to bring in, which matters more now than it did a year ago, given the convoys. Thrace's crest flattened slightly. A tell Nora had learned to read as she agrees but won't say so in a room with a recorder running. The review isn't mine to overrule, Wren. If your department can't show clearer numbers by the deadline, Fleet Command will reassign the staff and repurpose the bay. That includes you. Reassign to where? The outer mining platforms have a labor shortage. Nora had been on Halyard Depot long enough to know exactly what that meant. Nobody came back from the outer platforms with the same number of fingers they'd left with. I'll have clearer numbers, she said, and left before her voice could do anything unhelpful. Fen was waiting outside, all 6 limbs folded in the patient coil Australia used instead of sitting. Bad? They asked. They want to shut us down and call it efficiency. They always do. This is how the Kessa clean a floor. They remove the mess, not the cause of the mess. Fen fell into step beside her. claws clicking softly against the deck plating. "What will you do?" "Make better numbers." Nora paused at a junction, glancing down the corridor toward the fuel bay, where a maintenance crew had been arguing with a stalled cargo hauler for the better part of an hour. Also that. The hauler was a squat, ugly thing, one of the old bulk transports that hauled reclaimed water between the ring sections. Its fuel coupling had seized, and the two Kessa technicians working on it had the particular stiff posture of people who had exhausted their actual knowledge and were now just repeating the same diagnostic in case it changed its answer. "Replacement parts back-ordered 11 days, one of them was saying. "Compact standard coupling, model isn't stocked here." Nora crouched by the hauler's undercarriage without being asked, which got her a look from both technicians that suggested reclamation staff weren't generally expected to know which end of a fuel line was which. She turned the seized coupling over in her hands, ran a thumb along the worn threading, then reached into the satchel she carried everywhere and pulled out one of the 3 fuel couplings from that morning's crate, the ones marked too worn for reuse, headed for the melt. "This won't fit," the technician said. "Different spec." "It's not going in as is." Nora pulled a small torch and a strip of gasket material from a satchel, and began, with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this 100 times in far worse conditions, to reshape the old coupling's collar to fit the hauler's housing. It took 11 minutes. The technicians watched the first 4 of them with open skepticism and the last 7 in silence. When she fitted it and the hauler's status light flicked from red to amber to green, nobody said anything for a moment. "That part was scrap," the technician finally managed. "Most things are scrap right up until they're not," Nora said, wiping her hands on a jacket. "You just have to be willing to ask them for less than they were designed to give." Fen, watching from the junction, made the low clicking sound that passed for an Australian laugh. "Write that down. Put it in your efficiency report. Watch nobody understand it." Nora almost smiled again. This time she let herself. It wasn't a skill anyone on Halyard Depot valued, not really, not the way they valued combat readiness or diplomatic standing or clean quarterly numbers. But she'd learned it the way her grandmother had taught her, in a house with no power for 3 winters straight, in a world that had spent centuries being unkind to the people who lived on it and had, somewhere along the way, taught all of them the same quiet lesson. Nothing is really gone until you've stopped looking for a use for it. She thought about the data spike in her jacket pocket, and the numbers that didn't match. She hadn't stopped looking yet. The Australia had a saying, which Fen translated for her over cold protein rations 3 days later. Waste is a question you were too lazy to finish asking. It was, Fen admitted, not a popular saying among the Kessa, who preferred their categories tidy, useful, useless, done. "That's the whole problem with this station," Nora said, turning her cup in her hands. "Everyone here decides what something is worth once, up front, and never checks again." "Including you," Fen said. "You decided humans were worth underestimating, and let them keep believing it." She hadn't decided that, exactly. It had decided itself, in 100 small interactions over 6 years, the way water finds the lowest point in a room without anyone directing it there. The Kessa administered the compact with a fussy, ledger-driven precision that made them excellent bureaucrats and mediocre judges of anything that didn't fit their categories cleanly. Humanity, in their files, fit under low-technology origin world, recent compact member, non-priority species, a classification written decades ago by someone who had never had to survive a season without power and had never updated it since. Nora didn't correct people's assumptions, mostly, because correcting them cost more than it earned. It was easier to be underestimated and useful than to be resented and merely equal. But the ledger fragments sat in her jacket like a stone she couldn't put down. She'd spent 3 nights running the numbers properly, cross-referencing the corrupted fragment against every public supply report Halyard Depot had filed for the last 2 years. The station's official coolant reserves had been reported as stable, dipping with use, replenished on schedule, exactly the boring flat line you'd expect from competent management. The real number, if the fragment was right, had been quietly falling for 6 months. Not by an amount that would show up in any single report. By an amount that would only show up if you added a year of small lies together and asked what they sum to. "I need someone who understands ledger formatting better than I do," she told Fen, low, in the reclamation bay where the ambient machine noise made eavesdropping difficult. Compact accounting, not station maintenance. Fen's mandibles clicked in the pattern that meant they were thinking hard. Ulm Marist runs Provisions Directorate. If anyone on this station could tell you whether that fragment is a formatting artifact or a real discrepancy, it's him. He built half those reporting templates himself. Isn't he the one pushing the new rationing schedule? He is the one who will be credited with the new rationing schedule, yes. Officially, it comes from Fleet Command. Unofficially, everyone knows whose numbers they're built from. Something cold moved through Nora's chest, quiet and unhurried, the way understanding sometimes arrived, not as a shock but as a shape finally resolving out of noise she'd been staring at too long to see clearly. The man tightening the station's belt was the same man whose department controlled the ledgers that said the belt needed tightening. She didn't say any of that out loud. She wasn't ready to, not with a corrupted data fragment and a bad feeling as her only evidence. Instead she asked Fen a smaller, safer question. Would he notice if I ask him about formatting directly? He would notice you exist for the first time in 6 years, which is its own kind of answer. Fen's claws tapped against the workbench, a habit Nora had learned meant I am about to say something you won't like. Wren, if there is something wrong in those numbers, and you go asking a man who may be the reason they're wrong to explain them to you, that is not a clever plan. That is a plan with your name already written on the consequences. I know. Then don't do the clever version. Do the slow version. Watch first. She copied the fragment a second time, hid the copy somewhere Fen didn't ask about, and went back to sorting bolts. Underscore 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 underscore. The small crack widened 2 days later, in the shape of an inventory audit provisions directorate ran on every department storage. Routine, unremarkable, the kind of thing that happened every quarter. Except this time, when the auditor, a junior Kessa clerk with trembling wings and a stack of forms, reached the reclamation bay's coolant recovery logs, he flagged an entry as inconsistent with directorate records and moved on without explanation, exactly as if the discrepancy belonged to Nora's department and not somewhere further up the chain. Nora watched him leave with the polite, distracted alarm of someone filing a form that would, without any deliberate cruelty from anyone involved, end up landing on the wrong desk. She pulled the flagged entry herself, that night, alone in the bay with only the hum of the water reclaimer for company. The entry recorded coolant material reclamations crews had recovered and logged over the last 2 months, a real number, one she'd verified with her own hands, crate by crate. Provisions Directorate's records showed a different number for the same period. Smaller. Consistently, precisely smaller, by almost exactly the same margin as the discrepancy in the corrupted fragment. Somebody wasn't losing coolant to inefficiency. Somebody was moving it somewhere the ledgers weren't supposed to show. She sat with that for a long time before she finally slept, and when she did, she dreamed, not for the first time since coming to Halyard Depot, about her grandmother's kitchen, the year the grid failed, and the particular, patient look on the old woman's face as she taught a frightened 9-year-old how to make a working stove out of a coffee can and a candle. Nothing is really gone, her grandmother used to say, until somebody decides it is and stops looking. Somebody on this station had decided the truth was gone. Nora intended to keep looking anyway. She told Fen everything the next morning, in pieces, over the noise of the water reclaimer running its slow cycle. You're certain the discrepancy isn't a translation error, Fen said, after Nora had walked them through both sets of numbers twice. Human and Kessa units convert cleanly for coolant volume, but I've seen stranger mistakes. I ran it 4 ways. It's not conversion. It's the same number, twice, and they don't agree, and the smaller one is the one that made it into every public report Marist's office has filed for 6 months. Fen was quiet for a long moment, all 6 limbs still, which for an Australie was the equivalent of a human going pale. If you are right, this is not a filing error. This is fraud, on a station under active supply pressure, run by a man with authority over both the ledgers and the rationing policy those ledgers justify. A pause. Do you understand what happens to the person who accuses a provisions director of that, on a Kessa-administered station, without proof solid enough to survive a formal challenge? They lose. Badly. Probably lose their department too, on the way down. They lose everything, Wren. Careers here don't survive false accusations against superiors, even when the accusation turns out to be true. Especially when it turns out to be true, because then somebody has to explain how it happened under their own administration, and the easiest explanation is always that the person who noticed was troublemaking, not truthful. Nora had already worked that out on her own, somewhere around 2 in the morning, staring at numbers that refused to reconcile no matter how she turned them. She didn't need Fen to tell her the shape of the trap. She needed something else, something she suspected Fen already knew she'd ask for and had been dreading regardless. I need proof solid enough that it survives the challenge, she said. Which means I can't bring a corrupted fragment and a mismatched ledger entry. I need the actual movement, where the coolant's going, not just where it isn't. That means finding physical evidence of a diversion, on a station with restricted access to every system that would show it. I know. You are reclamation staff. You have clearance for scrap, water, and cable. You do not have clearance for cargo manifests, fuel routing, or anything that would tell you where 6 months of missing coolant actually went. Nora looked around the reclamation bay, the racks of stripped conduit, the bins under the hand-painted sign, the water reclaimer humming through its patient cycle, and felt something settle into place, quiet and certain, the way a bolt finds its thread. I have clearance for scrap, she agreed. Everything that comes off every system on the station passes through this room eventually. Fen. Broken parts. Rejected shipments. Anything somebody decided wasn't worth tracking anymore. She pulled the data spike out of her jacket and turned it over in her fingers. The cracked, discarded thing that had started all of this, thrown out by someone who never imagined it would be read. Marist's people have been careful with the ledgers. I'd bet good rations they haven't been nearly as careful with what they throw away. Fen's mandibles clicked, slow, considering. Then, unmistakably, amusement, dry and real. You intend to catch a fraud by going through his garbage. I intend to catch a fraud the same way I do everything else on the station. By asking what everyone else already decided was worthless. That is either going to work spectacularly, Fen said, or get us both sent to the mining platforms with matching sentences. Then let's make sure it works. They started that night, methodically, the way Nora did everything, cross-referencing every discarded manifest, damaged terminal, and rejected shipment log that had passed through reclamation from Provisions Directorate over the last 6 months, building a picture one discarded fragment at a time. It was slow. It was, by any Kessa standard, an absurd way to investigate anything. It was also, Nora reflected, exactly the kind of work nobody on Halyard Depot would ever think to stop her from doing, because nobody on Halyard Depot believed the reclamation bay was where anything important happened. That, she was beginning to understand, might turn out to be the most useful mistake anyone here had ever made. The alarm hit during third shift, the kind of sound that didn't announce a drill. Nora was 3 hours into cross-referencing a fuel manifest when the bay's light shifted to amber and the station widecom crackled with the flat, controlled voice of Overseer Thrace. Coolant containment failure, Ring Section 4. All available maintenance personnel report to Junction 7C. This is not a drill. Fen was already moving before the message finished. Ring 4. That's residential, outer families, low priority quarters. Their claws found the emergency kit bolted beneath the workbench without needing to look. If containment's failing there, whatever's left of the reserve is venting straight into a section with children in it. Nora grabbed her satchel and ran. Junction 7C was chaos by the time they arrived, Kessa maintenance crews shouting over each other in short bureaucratic bursts that wasted precious seconds establishing whose jurisdiction the failure fell under, a cloud of pale vapor already curling from a cracked containment seam along the corridor's coolant main, and, at the center of it, Overseer Thrace, crest fully raised, trying to get a straight answer out of anyone. 0.4%, Nora said, mostly to herself, arriving at a dead run. It was 0.4%. The seam that had failed was the exact section she'd flagged in a maintenance ticket that had sat unopened in a queue for a week and a half. She didn't have time to be angry about that. She dropped to her knees in front of the containment housing, ignoring the sting of cold vapor against exposed skin, and did the thing she'd trained her whole life for without ever calling it training. She looked at a broken system and asked it, patiently, what it needed instead of what it was supposed to have. Fen. I need the coupling kit and something to seal a breach that's already lost pressure integrity. The standard patches won't hold, the seam's warped. Fen didn't ask questions. They dumped the kit beside her and started stripping insulation from a length of cable with 3 hands while feeding tools to Nora's outstretched palm with the others, an efficiency of motion that looked, to the panicking Kessa crew around them, almost frighteningly calm. You can't patch a warped seam with standard tools, one of the Kessa technicians said, voice climbing toward panic. It needs a replacement section. We don't have a spare, the requisition. We are not replacing it. We are reshaping the seal around it. Nora was already working, hands moving with the same unhurried precision she'd used on the fuel coupling 3 days earlier, except now every second mattered in a way it hadn't then. She packed gasket material into the warp, wrapped stripped cable around the housing to hold tension where the original bolts couldn't reach anymore, and directed Fen through a jury-rigged bypass that routed pressure around the weakest point in the seam instead of fighting it directly. It took 6 minutes. It felt considerably longer. Somewhere behind her, in the crowd of watching residents that had gathered at the edges of the junction, a child was crying, not from pain, just from the particular fear of watching adults be frightened. Nora heard it without letting it pull her attention off the housing in front of her. She'd heard that exact sound before, a long time ago, in a kitchen with no power, and she remembered, with the strange clarity of a memory surfacing at the worst possible moment, her grandmother's hands moving over a stove built from things the neighbors had already thrown away, steady and unhurried, refusing to let the crying in the next room change the pace of the work. Panic doesn't fix a coupling, the old woman used to say. Patience does, even when patience feels like the wrong speed for the moment you're in. Nora kept her hand steady and her pace exactly as slow as the work required, and not 1 second slower. When the vapor cloud thinned and the containment gauge crawled back from red toward amber, the corridor went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it has just watched something it didn't believe was possible. Overseer Thrace crossed the corridor and looked at the patched seam, then at Nora, kneeling in a puddle of condensation with her hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline and cold. "That will not hold indefinitely," Thrace said. "No," Nora agreed. "It'll hold until the replacement section arrives, if requisition actually processes it this time instead of losing it in a queue for a week and a half, which is more time than Ring 4 had 5 minutes ago." Thrace's crest lowered, slowly, into something that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite gratitude, but sat somewhere honest between the two. "You flagged this." "I flagged this. As a maintenance ticket. It's still in the queue behind about 400 others that also never got opened." Something crossed the overseer's face then, not quite surprise, not quite shame, but the particular stillness of someone doing fast, uncomfortable arithmetic about how many other flagged tickets might be sitting unopened in that same queue, and what else might be quietly failing behind them. "Provisions Directorate manages the maintenance queue triage," Thrace said, half to herself. "Yes," Nora said. "They do." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She watched the thought land, and watched the overseer decide, visibly, not to chase it any further in a corridor full of witnesses. It was, Nora thought, watching Thrace walk away, the first time in 6 years anyone with real authority on this station had looked at her like she might be worth listening to. It felt less like victory than she'd expected. It felt like the moment before a much larger door opened. The station celebrated, in the small, exhausted way stations under blockade celebrate anything, an extra ration cycle authorized for Ring 4's residents, a formal commendation log for the reclamation department, Prif the Kessler clerk actually thanking her for a report for the first time in 6 years, awkwardly, like the gesture didn't fit in his mouth. Nora let herself enjoy exactly one evening of it before the discomfort crept back in. "It doesn't add up," she told Fen, the two of them alone in the bay again, the celebratory mood of the corridors not quite reaching this far into the station's underused sections. "Containment seams don't warp like that from ordinary wear. Not on a schedule. Not 11 months before Spec predicted it, in a section that happens to be the exact one feeding a residential ring with the lowest political weight on the station." Fen went very still. "You think it was deliberate?" "I think somebody's been diverting coolant reserve for 6 months, and somebody, maybe the same somebody, maybe not, decided that if the theft was ever going to be noticed, it needed to look like an accident happening somewhere nobody with real influence would push hard to investigate. Ring 4 doesn't have senators. It doesn't have anyone with the standing to demand an inquiry. That is a serious accusation to make about a containment failure." "It's not an accusation. It's a question I can't stop asking." Nora pulled up the fragments of manifest data she and Fen had been assembling for 2 weeks, arranging them on the shared terminal until a rough shape started to emerge. Shipment records that didn't match cargo weights, fuel allocations logged for runs that, according to docking records, had never actually launched, small percentages skimmed consistently from a dozen different categories, all of it routed, eventually, through requisitions signed by the same office. Ulmerist's office. "If I bring this to the overseer now," Nora said slowly, "it's still not proof. It's a pattern. A convincing one, but Marist built these reporting templates. He'll have an explanation ready for every individual piece, because he's had 6 months to prepare one." "Then what would be proof?" The physical shipment. Coolant doesn't vanish, Fen. It goes somewhere. If it's being smuggled off station instead of consumed here, there's a transfer point, a docking bay, a courier ship, something with a manifest that Merist's office doesn't control, because it belongs to whoever's receiving it on the other end. Fen's claws drummed against the workbench, considering. Halyard's smuggling routes, historically, run through the unregistered docking arms on the station's dark side, old maintenance berths nobody's used for legitimate traffic in years. If I were moving something I didn't want logged, that's where I'd move it. Can you get me access? I can get myself access. Officially, I have maintenance clearance for every berth on the station, dark side included, because someone has to periodically confirm they're not falling apart. Fen paused. You do not have that clearance. Then I'll come as your assistant. Nobody questions reclamation staff carrying tools. Nobody questions reclamation staff at all, Fen said. That has been, until now, the entire problem. It was also, Nora thought, exactly the advantage they needed. The dark side berths were as neglected as Fen had promised. Cold, dim, half the overhead lighting dead and never replaced, the kind of forgotten infrastructure that only reclamation staff ever really looked at closely. They found the transfer point on the third berth they checked, fresh scoring on the deck plating where something heavy had been dragged repeatedly, a coolant residue trace along a service hatch that had no business carrying coolant at all, and, tucked behind a maintenance panel that hadn't been resealed properly, a small logging terminal that didn't belong to any system Nora recognized. She almost didn't touch it. 6 years of being careful told her to leave it exactly where it was and report the location instead. But the terminal was already half corrupted, its casing cracked in a way that suggested somebody had tried, unsuccessfully, to wipe it in a hurry, and Nora had learned a long time ago that half-broken things left behind in a hurry were usually the most honest things you'd find. She pulled the data without touching the housing further, hands steady despite the cold sweat gathering at the back of her neck, and copied it onto a drive that had never once been connected to a station system. The logs, when she and Fen reviewed them later in the bay, were unambiguous in a way the manifests never had been. Coolant transfers, time-stamped and receipted, routed to a courier vessel registered under a shell designation that traced, after an hour of careful cross-referencing, back to a private account belonging to Merist. 6 months of Halyard Depot's slow, quiet siege had a name attached to it now, and it wasn't a blockade outside the station. It was a man inside it, selling the station's reserves out from under a rationing schedule he himself had ordered, to buyers Nora didn't yet have a name for and wasn't sure she wanted one for. We have it, Fen said quietly, staring at the logs. We actually have it. Nora didn't feel the relief she'd expected. She felt something colder, more careful, settling into its place instead, the particular, unglamorous dread of someone who has just found proof powerful enough to be dangerous to the person holding it. They sat with the logs a long while after that, neither of them quite ready to move, the bay's usual hum filling the silence where a plan should have been. Can I ask you something? Fen said eventually. That isn't about the case. You can ask. Why does it not frighten you more? A director with 6 months of preparation, a station that will believe his version of events before it believes yours, and you're sitting here calm enough to double-check a footnote. Fen's claws tapped once against the bench, an oddly gentle sound. Every other species I have worked with, faced with this much risk, would already be planning for the worst outcome instead of the next step. Nora considered the question longer than she usually let herself consider anything. Where I grew up, she said finally, things went wrong more often than they went right. Not dramatically. Just, constantly. Storms, shortages, systems that failed because nobody upstream had bothered to maintain them properly for people who didn't have the standing to complain. You learn, after enough of that fear doesn't actually buy you anything. It doesn't fix the coupling. It doesn't stretch the coolant. All fear does is spend time you don't have on a feeling that isn't going to change the outcome. She turned the drive over once in her hand, feeling its weight. So you get quiet instead. You get precise. You save the fear for later, when there's actually time to have it, and you use whatever time you've got now on the only thing that's ever fixed anything for people like me. The next useful thing. Fen was silent for a long moment, mandibles still. That is a very lonely way to survive a crisis. It's the only way I ever learned, Nora admitted. I'm working on the other kind. Slowly. You have company for it now, at least, Fen said, and there was something almost soft in the clicking cadence of it. For whatever that's worth against a provisions director. It's worth more than you'd think, Nora said, and meant it, and went back to cross-referencing the logs, because the fear, whatever there was of it, could wait exactly as long as it needed to. We have it, she said again, at last, the words settling differently the second time. Which means we need to be very, very careful about who finds out that we do. She wasn't careful enough. Or, more precisely, Marist had been watching the reclamation department more closely than anyone suspected, ever since a coolant discrepancy had somehow found its way onto a maintenance ticket and then, embarrassingly, into a corridor full of witnesses during a containment failure that should never have happened in the first place. They came for her 2 mornings later, before first bell, 3 Kessa security officers filling the reclamation bay's narrow doorway while Prif hovered behind them, wings drawn tight, refusing to meet her eyes. Nora Wren, the lead officer said, unfolding a data slate. You are being detained pending investigation into unauthorized system access on dark side berths, tampering with Directorate logging equipment, and falsification of maintenance records related to the Ring 4 containment incident. The floor of the bay seemed to tilt slightly under her. Falsification. I flagged that seam a week and a half before it failed. There's a timestamp ticket. A ticket you had access to modify, the officer said, not unkindly, just tired, the exhausted flatness of someone reading a script they hadn't written and didn't entirely believe. Provisions Directorate's records show the original flag was routine and non-urgent. Your copy shows an urgent flag with an earlier timestamp. One of those was altered after the fact. She understood, with a sick, cold clarity, exactly what had happened. Marist hadn't just diverted coolant. He'd had 6 months to build a version of events where anyone who noticed the diversion could be repainted, with a few careful edits to a record system he controlled completely, as the person responsible for the failure that exposed it. Where's Fen? She asked, because it was the only thing she could think to ask. Engineer Okra is being questioned separately. They took her satchel, her terminal, and the drive she'd copied the dark side logs onto, every piece of physical proof she had, gone in the space of 90 seconds, into evidence lockers controlled by a directorate she now understood, far too late, had never stopped watching her at all. You should have brought it to the overseer the moment you found it, Prif said quietly, from the doorway, unable to meet her eyes even now. Not sat on it for 2 weeks building a bigger case. I know that now, Nora said, and meant it. It was a small, bitter kind of clarity, the kind that only ever arrived once it was too late to be useful, the understanding that being careful and being safe were not, in fact, the same thing, and that a man with 6 months' head start on covering his own theft had used every one of those 2 careful weeks to prepare an answer for exactly this moment. The security officers walk her out through the reclamation bay on the way to the holding block, past racks of stripped conduit and bins of salvaged fasteners, and for one strange, suspended second she caught herself cataloguing the room the way she always did, out of habit. That bin needs sorting, that spool of cables tangled, someone left the water reclaimer running past its cycle again. Before she remembered that none of it was going to be her problem to fix for however long this took. It was, she thought, a genuinely bad time to discover how much she'd miss a junk room. The holding cell was small, grey, and quiet in a way that let her hear the station's ambient hum louder than she ever had in the reclamation bay, a reminder that somewhere in the walls around her, systems were still running, still failing, still being triaged by a queue controlled by the man who just had her arrested. She had been there perhaps 6 hours when the lights flickered, dimmed, and the low background hum of the station's air circulation changed pitch in a way that made every hair on her arms rise. An announcement followed, thin and controlled through the cell speaker. Attention. Life support fault detected in outer ring sections. Oxygen scrubber array offline in sections 3 through 6. Engineering teams are responding. Remain calm. Nora sat very still on the narrow cell bench, listening to the particular strain in the announcer's voice, the strain of someone reading a script that had clearly not accounted for a second failure this close to the first. She thought about the ledger, about coolant reserves that had been quietly falling for 6 months, and a man who controlled the queue that decided which maintenance tickets got opened and which sat for a week and a half unread. She thought about outer ring sections, the same low-priority residential rings that had nearly lost containment 2 weeks ago, now losing air, on a station where the person who should have been coordinating the emergency response instead had every reason in the galaxy to want the person capable of solving it locked in a cell where she couldn't. She stood up and pressed the cell's comm panel, the one meant for requesting water or medical attention, and pressed it until someone finally answered. "This is Wren, reclamation. I need to speak to whoever's coordinating the scrubber fault. I know what's failing and I know why, and every hour I spend in here instead of the reclamation bay is an hour outer ring goes without breathable air." There was a long silence on the other end, long enough that she thought no one had actually been listening. Then the cell door hissed and unlocked, and Overseer Bellin Thrace stood in the corridor beyond it, feathers disheveled, crest raised so high it looked almost painful, holding a data slate in one trembling claw. "The falsification charge against you doesn't hold," Thrace said, without preamble, without apology, the voice of someone who had spent the last several hours doing arithmetic she badly wished she hadn't had time for. "I pulled the original ticket timestamps myself an hour ago, from a backup log Marist's office doesn't control. Yours was never altered. His directorate's copy was." "I know," Nora said. "I could have told you that 6 hours ago, if anyone had asked." "I'm asking now." Thrace stepped aside from the cell door. Sections 3 through 6 have perhaps 90 minutes of breathable reserve left before the scrubber fault becomes irreversible for the people in it. Fleet Command's emergency response protocol calls for evacuation, which this station cannot execute in 90 minutes for 4 full residential sections. Her voice cracked, very slightly, on the next words. "Engineer Okra says you can fix this. Engineer Okra also says you will need access to the reclamation bay's full discard stockpile, and to every scrap of scavenged material this station has thrown away for the last 2 years, and that I am to give you both without argument or paperwork." Nora stepped out of the cell into a corridor that smelled, faintly, of a station running out of time. "Then get me to the bay," she said. "And find Marist. Not to arrest him yet. To keep him exactly where he is, doing exactly nothing, until I have proof solid enough that he can't explain his way out of it a second time." Thrace looked at her for a long moment, the particular look, Nora realized, of someone recalculating an entire 6-year assumption in the space of a single breath. "Yes," the Overseer said. "Understood." The reclamation bay looked, to anyone who'd never worked in it, like the last place on Halyard Depot capable of saving 4 residential sections from suffocation. Racks of stripped conduit, bins of scavenged fasteners under a hand-painted sign, a water reclaimer humming through its patient, ordinary cycle, indifferent to the crisis unfolding 6 decks away. To Nora, it looked exactly like what it was, the only room on the station full of things nobody had ever finished asking a question about. Fen was already there when she arrived, all 6 limbs moving, pulling parts from 3 different racks at once with the barely restrained urgency of someone who had spent the last several hours being questioned by security while knowing, with growing dread, exactly how this crisis would end if the person who understood it best wasn't in the room to solve it. "Scrubber arrays compromised across 4 sections," Fen said, without looking up. "Not failed, sabotaged. Same signature as the containment seam. Someone weakened the primary filtration coupling weeks ago. Time to fail once containment's replacement parts were in transit and everyone's attention was elsewhere." Marist bought himself a distraction and a body to blame for it, all at once, Nora said, already moving toward the discard racks, running her hands along components other people had long since stopped seeing as anything but garbage. "Efficient. I almost respect it. You have less than 90 minutes to be less than impressed and more than functional." "I know." She pulled 3 cracked housing units from a bin marked probably still good, turned them over in her hands, felt the shape of a solution starting to assemble itself the way it always did, not as a plan drawn out in advance, but as a conversation with the materials in front of her, each piece telling her what it could still become if she was willing to ask for less than it was originally built to give. "I need every spare filtration mesh we've pulled from old scrubber units in the last year," she said. "I need the spooled superconductor cable with the bad section. The good half, not the bad half, will cut around it. I need the 3 fuel couplings I reshaped for the hauler, if nobody's melted them down yet. And I need 4 working hands besides my own, because I cannot build 4 parallel bypass units alone in 90 minutes, and I am done pretending I need to." Fen didn't argue. Fen also didn't have 4 working hands to spare, but within minutes, word had reached the corridor outside, and it wasn't only Fen who arrived. Priff came first, still in his directorate uniform, wings tucked tight, saying nothing about 6 years of dismissed reports, just holding out both trembling hands and asking what she needed him to carry. Two of the Kessa technicians from the containment repair followed, then a human dock worker Nora barely knew by name, then a handful of others, Reclamation's usual invisible crew, the people whose work nobody upstairs had ever bothered to count properly. Suddenly the only people on the station who knew exactly which discarded, worthless component could become exactly the thing for residential sections needed to keep breathing. They built 4 bypass filtration units in the reclamation bay in under an hour, out of material that had, by every official record on Halyard Depot, already stopped existing the moment it was logged as scrap. Nora carried the first unit into Section 3 herself, hands steady despite the exhaustion burning through her arms, and fitted it into the compromised scrubber housing with the same unhurried precision she'd used on a fuel coupling that felt, now, like it belonged to a different lifetime. The array status light crawled from red through amber, hesitated, and settled, finally, on green. Somewhere down the corridor, a child was crying, quietly, the particular exhausted crying of someone who had been frightened for longer than any child should have to be. Nora didn't have time to comfort anyone. She had 3 more sections and less than 40 minutes. They made it, in the end, with 6 minutes to spare on the last section, not because anything about the plan had been elegant, but because Reclamation had spent 2 years quietly, invisibly, refusing to let anything go to waste, and on the one night it mattered more than any efficiency report ever had. That refusal turned out to be the only thing standing between 4 residential sections and a very quiet, very official catastrophe. Ol Marist was arrested 3 hours later, in his own office, holding a data slate with a falsified log he hadn't quite finished rewriting. Once Thrace's investigators cross-referenced the Darkside Courier manifest against his private accounts and found the same shell designation Nora had found 2 weeks earlier, except this time backed by every piece of physical evidence a formal compact challenge would require, gathered not by a security team, but by a reclamation clerk and an Australi engineer who had spent 2 weeks going through a provisions director's garbage. He didn't make a speech when they took him. He didn't get the chance to. Belen Thrace read the charges herself, in a voice that carried, deliberately, all the way down the corridor to where Nora stood, still smelling faintly of scorched gasket material, watching a man who had spent 6 months quietly starving his own station finally run out of numbers he could bend. Thrace found her there afterward. The falsification charge against you is withdrawn. Formally, and permanently, on the record. The overseer's crest had settled into something Nora hadn't seen it do before, not the raised alarm of the audit, not the flattened irritation of their first meeting, but something closer to stillness, the posture of someone genuinely, uncomfortably reconsidering 6 years of easy assumptions. The efficiency review is also withdrawn. Reclamation's resource allocation will be reassessed under a different framework, one that accounts for what your department actually recovers, instead of what's easy to undercount. That's good, Nora said, too tired to feel much beyond the exhaustion settling into her bones. What about Ring 4? 3 through 6. Recovering. All of them. Thrace hesitated, an unusual thing for her. You are aware, I assume, that reclamation staff do not, technically, have the clearance to be building emergency life support infrastructure. I'm aware there wasn't time to fill out the paperwork. There will be time to update the paperwork, Thrace said, and something in her tone made it almost, unmistakably, dry, the closest thing to human Nora had ever heard from her. Retroactively, I think, given the circumstances. Nora looked past her, down the corridor, to where the reclamation bay's lights still burned, bright and unglamorous, a room nobody on this station had ever thought was worth much of anything until it turned out to be the only room capable of saving all of them. Good, she said, because I've got a lot more scrap in there nobody's finished asking about. The station took 3 days to fully stabilize, and in those 3 days, Nora Wren discovered the peculiar, uncomfortable experience of being noticed by people who had spent years not bothering to learn her name. Fleet Command's formal inquiry into Marist's smuggling network moved fast, once the physical evidence made the outcome undeniable, faster, Fenn observed dryly, than any inquiry had ever moved on Halyard Depot for a matter that didn't involve a Kessa's reputation directly. The Shell Courier's manifest led, eventually, to a small trading consortium operating just outside compact jurisdiction, buying strategic reserves cheap from officials willing to starve their own stations to sell them. Halyard Depot wasn't the only way station on the list. It was, investigators concluded, simply the first one where someone had noticed. Priff came by the reclamation bay on the second day, formally this time, with an actual apology instead of a manifest. "I should have read the report," he said, standing stiffly in the doorway the way he always had, though something about his wings had loosened since the last time she'd seen him there. 6 years of reports. "I should have read at least one of them properly." "You read this last one," Nora said. "That's the one that mattered." "That is generous of you to say." "It's accurate. I don't have the energy to be generous today, Priff. I've been awake for most of 3 days." She meant it as a small joke, and was faintly startled when Priff's mouth did something that, on a Kessa, passed for a smile. Fen found her later that evening, sorting bolts again, because some things, thankfully, hadn't changed at all. "The Overseer wants to formalize a new department charter," Fen said, settling into their usual coil beside the workbench. "Reclamation and recovery, expanded mandate, expanded staff, direct reporting line to the Overseer's office instead of buried under Provisions Directorate." "Whose office is running Provisions now?" "Nobody's, yet. There's a vacancy." Fen's claws tapped, deliberate, against the bench. "There has been, more than once today, a suggestion that the department best positioned to understand where this station's resources actually go might be worth consulting on who fills it." Nora set the terminal down and looked at Fen for a long moment. "That's not a job I want." "I did not say it was an offer for you specifically." A pause, and then, unmistakably, Australian amusement, dry as ever. "Though I notice you did not ask who they were considering instead." "I don't want to run a directorate, Fen. I want a bay that works, a crew that isn't scared of getting reassigned to the mines every quarter, and maybe, eventually, a coolant reserve number that means what it says it means." She picked the terminal back up. "That's a smaller thing to want than a directorate. I've found it's usually the more useful one." Fen didn't argue. Fen just watched her go back to sorting bolts, the same unhurried, deliberate motion she'd been making for 6 years in a room nobody had bothered to take seriously, and said nothing at all about how much that had already changed. Later that evening, a small delegation arrived at the bay's open doorway, 3 residents from Ring 4, a Kessa family with 2 fledglings still small enough to be carried. Come to say a thank you, none of them seemed quite sure how to phrase in a room that smelled like hot metal and grease. They didn't stay long. They left a woven strip of dyed fiber, some small domestic craft from their own quarters, tied to the handle of one of the storage racks, and went home without making a speech out of it. Nora looked at the little strip of fiber for a long moment after they'd gone, hanging there among bins of scrap and salvage, out of place and somehow exactly right. "You could take that down," Fen said. "It isn't reclaimed material. It doesn't belong on inventory." "No," Nora agreed, and left it exactly where it was. "It doesn't." She didn't move it again after that. 6 years from now, when new staff asked what it was doing there, among racks that held nothing but scrap and spare parts, whoever was running the bay by then would tell them it wasn't inventory. It was proof of something the reports had never once managed to measure. A week later, Overseer Thrace called a station-wide address, not the clipped, procedural tone she used for alarms, but something slower, more deliberate, the voice of an administrator choosing her words with unusual care. Nora watched it from the reclamation bay, standing among racks of stripped conduit and bins of salvaged fasteners, Fen beside her, Priff hovering near the door the way he'd taken to doing lately, as if the bay had become somewhere worth lingering rather than somewhere to deliver bad news and leave quickly. 6 months ago, Thrace's voice carried through the station's comm system. This station's official record showed stable reserves, steady rationing, and a supply crisis managed with appropriate discipline. Those records were false, maintained by an official this administration trusted, and undetected by every review process this administration relied on. A pause, longer than procedure required. They were undone not by an inquiry, and not by Fleet Command, but by a department this administration had, for 6 years, considered too small to matter. I want that recorded, formally, in the station's history. Not as an embarrassment. As a correction we should have made a long time ago. Nora didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She looked around the reclamation bay, the same cramped room it had always been, the same hand-painted sign, the same hum of machinery that had never once cared whether anyone respected the work it made possible, and thought, not for the first time, about her grandmother's kitchen, and a coffee can, and a candle, and a lesson that had taken 30 years and one very bad week to finally prove useful to anyone but her. "They're going to want you in meetings now," Fen said quietly, beside her. "Official ones. With chairs, and agendas, and people who use your name correctly on the first try. I know. You don't sound thrilled about it. Nora picked up a strip length of conduit, turned it over in her hands, felt the small, familiar satisfaction of a piece of scrap that still had something left to give. I'll go to the meetings, she said. I'll answer the questions. But I'm keeping the bay. Whatever else changes on this station, I'm keeping the bay. Outside, past the bulkhead, Halyard Depot hummed on, recovering, slowly, the way stations under long sieges always recovered, one small repair at a time. Somewhere in that recovery, a new coolant shipment was being logged, this time by 3 separate departments instead of one office nobody had thought to double-check. Somewhere, a directorate was being rebuilt from people who'd learned, the hard way, that a number nobody questioned was a number somebody could quietly bend. And somewhere in the reclamation bay, exactly where she'd always been, a woman from a world that had never given her people anything easily kept doing the only thing she'd ever really needed to know how to do, looking at what everyone else had already decided was finished, and asking it, patiently, what it might still become. By the time the rest of the galaxy finished deciding what humans were worth, Halyard Depot had already learned better. It had simply taken a room full of scrap, and one very bad week, to ask the question properly.